Hello, I'm Vernon Billy, CEO of the California School Boards Association. Since March of this year, we all have been reeling from the impact of the coronavirus on our schools. This pandemic has truly shaken the fabric of our society and upended our entire school system in so many ways. I get it. So before I go any further, I want to commend you for your hard work and commitment you and your school leaders are demonstrating during this unprecedented time. I know it hasn't been easy. Sometimes there may be few obvious answers to the questions you face, but as your association, CSBA is committed to providing you with critical updates and tools that will help you navigate this crisis. You can find all of this information at www.csba.org/coronavirus. That's a special webpage we've built to capture crucial information for schools confronting COVID-19. I encourage you to visit this webpage and take advantage of all the resources on the site. We update this page almost daily, and it can serve as a valuable source of information for you in your fight against COVID-19. In addition, we'll be doing webinars on important topics related to COVID-19 guidance from state and federal officials, as well as topics directly related to your governance responsibilities. These webinars will complement the information that we currently provide on CSBA's Online Learning Center, which also includes curriculum related to the pandemic. We have a lot to offer, but we want to hear from you as well. I encourage you to also use this webpage to share your experiences on how your district or county office is addressing the challenges related to this virus. CSBA will continue to work on your behalf as this crisis unfolds. The vital role your schools play in your communities has never been more apparent. I thank you for your leadership during this tumultuous period and pledge to support you and our students through this challenging period. Thank you again. Be safe and remember to practice good social distancing.
I'd like to welcome the audience out there in the virtual world to our discussion about how you can lawfully and effectively host school board meetings in this unprecedented time where everyone is coping with school closures and trying to communicate important information and policies to a constituency which is filled with anxiety about their students, about life in general, and how schools are going to proceed as they move through uncharted waters. The CSBA CEO and Executive Director, Vernon Billy, whom you just heard from, has been concerned with this issue since the outset. He has been constantly urging staff to get information out to our members and has taken the pandemic seriously before that was the common way to approach the issue. In fact, we shut down our offices in CSBA prior to the statewide stay-at-home mandate. And so for that reason, we are each coming to you from our individual homes here, a little bit different arrangement than the normal CSBA webinar. So we hope you'll bear with us through any technical issues as we are also navigating this new environment in which we are disseminating critical information to key constituents. We have a panel of experts here who have a lot of information to share, and I trust that they will be able to demystify some of these issues about how you can remain transparent and accountable to the public while still respecting the public health measures and stay at home. We're honored to have with us Mike Smith. Roll the slide back, please. Mike Smith of Lozano Smith, the founding partner. Also, William Tunick of Dennis Wolliver Kelly, a shareholder at that firm. Here, internal to CSBA, we have Bob Turk, CSBA Assistant Executive Director of Policy and Governance Technology Services. That's a long title, but Bob is head of the department that produces CSBA sample policies and helps you devise your policy manuals. And he's one of the state's biggest experts on those issues. And we also have our Associate General Counsel, Mike Ambrose, who writes many of the legal columns and the legal briefs that you read, in addition to supporting our legislative work with the Education Legal Alliance. So great panel here today, and I know you will appreciate the insight that they have to offer. And so we will kick off the presentation by exploring the Brown Act and how that applies to meetings in our current environment.
Hey, thank you, Troy. I'll get us started off here. As Troy explained, what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about the Brown Act. Everyone hear me okay? We're going to cover the Brown Act, and first we're going to start off with a quick recap of what the Brown Act is. The purpose of this webinar is not an in-depth exploration of the Brown Act, but really to talk about what it requires generally, and then talk about how it's changed in this world of COVID-19 and the pandemic we're facing. We're going to give some specific attention to public participation, because we know that's a big topic that's coming up around the state. And then throughout the course of this webinar, we're going to spend a little bit of time. Our panel will come back for some panel discussions. And we encourage you to continue to submit questions. We won't address them during that discussion, but as Troy said, we'll address all questions at the end. So please do submit them and we'll make sure we get to those and address them. I also wanted to just point out at the end of the slide deck, there is a slide that has a list of some of the board bylaws that specifically address public meetings and your school board meetings. We've reviewed those bylaws, and they are for consistency with the executive orders that have come out. We've determined none of them are inconsistent, so that's a good thing. You don't have to go and revise any of your bylaws, but to the extent that there may be inconsistencies, maybe around how you have your teleconferencing set up, we believe that the governor's executive orders are going to supersede those bylaws, and at this time I wouldn't recommend you go and revise your bylaws since they have been suspended by the governor's orders. The risk there would be if you revised your bylaws, you have to make sure that you go back and re-revise them in a timely manner if you do decide to go ahead and take that action to amend bylaws to be consistent with the executive order. But again, the executive order would supersede, so there's no need to do that at this point. Next slide, please. So first, let's just do a little recap of what the Brown Act is. Public boards, commissions, and councils in California, including school boards at districts and county offices, exist to aid in the conduct of the people's business. So what that means is that we have to take actions and deliberations openly and in the public. We can't have backroom deals, which requires open meetings to be held in the public unless there is a specific reason to hold a closed session part of that meeting. Those reasons are enumerated in your board bylaws in 9321 on closed session. There's a number of them. The ones that really come to mind most frequently and are most frequently addressed with school districts are personnel matters, negotiation for collective bargaining, matters related to confidential student information, security, and real property negotiations. Also, pending litigation is another one that gets brought up quite a lot. So again, those are all listed in Board Bylaw 9321. If you have questions on those, you can review your bylaw or contact your local attorneys for those. Another important key aspect of the Brown Act is its notice and agenda requirement. It does require you to provide certain notice of what you will be speaking about so the public has opportunity to participate. Meeting agendas and board packets need to be made available upon request in appropriate formats when necessary, alternative formats for people with disabilities. And those agendas need to be posted in a location that's accessible to the general public. During this pandemic, it's appropriate that they get posted on your website, which is one of the newer requirements, that it be posted on your website, assuming that you have one. Postings on the website need to be consistent with the law changes that happened with AB 2257. And that means that you have to have them posted as a direct link on your main website. If you use an integrated agenda management platform like Gamut Meetings, then you can have a link directly to that site as long as it's on the home page and you're not hiding your agenda links in some sort of contextual menu. You need to make sure that it's a one-click access, retrievable, downloadable, and can be searchable. So that's an important thing to remember as more and more people will be going to your websites looking for board meeting agendas rather than showing up to your school facilities to see what you've posted at the front door there. Also, the public has a general right to address the school board or the legislative body on any item that's on the agenda or that's in the interest of the public and within the subject matter of the jurisdiction of the legislative body. So if it pertains to school boards, whether or not it's on the agenda, they can come and speak to you on that during public comment. It's important to remember that this isn't a period of discussion with the board. It's an opportunity for the public to make comment, because the board meetings are in fact the meetings of the board that the public can participate in. It's not the public's meetings. So that's an important key component to remember. As we go forward with increased precautions in place for large gatherings, public agencies are continually faced with the need to make decisions quickly in response to the latest information that's coming available. So we'll address guidance for conducting public meetings in light of the COVID pandemic as we go forward with this webinar. Next slide, please. So we start off with what is a meeting, and some of this is probably going to be recap for a lot of you, but for newer board members, I think it's important that we cover this because it's critical to what's going on with COVID-19 as well as just your meetings in general. A meeting is any congregation of a majority of the school board members at the same time in the same place to hear, discuss, or deliberate on an item that's within the agency's jurisdiction. It could be a meeting, even if you're just talking about it, you don't have to take any action. So be mindful of that as you're having these conferences, whether it's through Zoom or on the phone, that you could be conducting a meeting inadvertently. That said, there are certain things that are not a meeting that we need to clarify as well. Those are individual contacts, as long as it's a one-to-one or one-to-two conversation that doesn't constitute a majority of the board having that communication. And that you're not using sort of the wheel and spoke method where one person A talks to B, person B then talks to C, person C then loops back around and talks to person A. You could be conducting a meeting, a serial meeting that way. So you want to make sure you're not doing that. Other things that aren't meetings are attending public conferences. That could include conferences by Zoom, community meetings, and other social gatherings, which during this time, hopefully you're not having that and you're obeying the social distancing guidelines. It's also important to make sure you're keeping in mind public perception during all of this, because whether or not it technically constitutes a meeting, as you all know, as school board members, what the public perceives to be true is often more important than what actually is true. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Mike Ambrose, CSBA's Assistant General Counsel, so he can talk to you a little bit more about meetings in light of COVID-19. Take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Bob. Hi, all. Next slide, please. So one of the exceptions that's come up with the Governor Newsom's executive orders allows members of a governing board to receive updates, and this includes receiving an update altogether with the majority or with all of your board from federal, state, and local officials relevant to the impacts of COVID-19, the government's response to COVID-19, and other aspects relevant to the declared emergency. That's without it being a meeting under the Brown Act. So what does that allow then? Board members are allowed to ask questions of those federal, state, and local officials who provide the updates. This idea is to allow board members to stay up to date on operations during this pandemic and the impact of the pandemic and the government's response relevant to their community. So what's not allowed then under that exception? Members cannot discuss amongst themselves or take action on any item of business that's within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board, so any board business there, without creating a meeting that needs to then be noticed under the Brown Act. And a little more, Bob touched on this a little bit, but it's a good time to remind board members to be aware of the risk of serial meetings with electronic communications. Remember, please, that communication involving a majority of your board to discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item of district business must occur in a notice meeting. Discussing board business with a majority of your board, whether it's by email or social media or any other medium, could lead to a Brown Act violation. If you want more information on that, check your board bylaw 9012 on board member electronic communication. Next slide, please. And I'm going to touch a little more on existing rules that haven't been impacted but are still important for this discussion about board meetings during COVID-19, during the pandemic. And then we're going to get more into strategies for your virtual meeting and more about the waivers under Governor Newsom in the latter half of this presentation. So please remember, for a regular meeting, the requirements for notice for the community are still the same. The agenda for a regular school board meeting still has to be posted at least 72 hours prior to the meeting. A special meeting can be called at any time by the board president or a majority of the board members. Written notice of the special meeting has to be posted at least 24 hours before the meeting. The notice has to specify what the business is that the board is going to discuss or take action on, and no other business beyond what's specified in the agenda there can be considered at that meeting. The third type of meeting here, emergency meetings. In the case of an emergency situation, the board can hold an emergency meeting without complying with the 24-hour notice requirement for a special meeting. The rest of the rules there, the board has to comply with all the other requirements for a special meeting during an emergency meeting. It seems like pretty much anything right now should be an emergency meeting under the COVID-19 pandemic. The board should be careful there. You should work with your district council to make sure that the COVID-19 related item in need of discussion actually meets the definition of an emergency under the Brown Act. The definition of an emergency hasn't changed there. I think it's likely that a lot of the things you may need to talk about in an emergency situation under this pandemic would fit, but there are code sections specifically on this. So an emergency is defined as work stoppage, crippling activity, or other activity that severely impairs the public health and or safety as determined by a majority of the members of the board. For an emergency meeting, the board president has to give notice of the meeting by telephone at least 1 hour before the meeting to the local media that have requested notice for the special meeting. We get this question that comes up about an emergency meeting versus an emergency situation and what the difference is and how we can add something to a regular agenda here. So an item, a board can call an emergency meeting when needed, but if you already have a regular meeting scheduled and that emergency item comes up in between that 72-hour period when you post your agenda and then have the meeting, there are a couple exceptions that allow you to discuss non-agenda items at a regular meeting. So the first one I'll talk about quickly is the 2/3 exception. And an action can be taken on an item that does not appear on the posted agenda for a regular meeting if 2/3 of the members of the governing board vote that there's a need to take immediate action on it, and that the need for that action came about subsequent to the agenda being posted. And the emergency situation exception is, boards can discuss or take action on a non-agenda item upon a determination by a majority of the board that an emergency situation exists under the same definition as an emergency meeting. You'll find more information on the special meetings and emergency meetings under Board Bylaw 9320, Meetings and Notices. But if you're looking to add an item to your agenda after it's been posted to deliberate on a non-agenda item, it's actually in a separate board bylaw. You'll want to look at 9323.2, Actions by the Board. Next slide, please. And if we could have the other panelists join for any discussion on what's come up so far.
So one thing that comes to mind that we've sort of talked about a little bit is, how much is this now a technical world and how everybody's doing this online. That could create some angst for people who have technical difficulties or are concerned about whether or not their internet's going to stay up. I know there was a recent issue in the West Sacramento area just yesterday with an internet provider that went down and the concerns that that might create with respect to notice and posting. Just to provide a little clarity on that, the Attorney General back in 2016 issued an opinion. It's not binding law, it's the AG opinion that if there is technical difficulty with the district website, it does not necessarily constitute a violation of the Brown Act with respect to their posting. So I think that that should all give us a little bit of peace of mind with respect to the technical age we're in now.
I also just wanted to quickly add, I think a lot of what we've been talking about, we tend to think of in the terms of governing board meetings, but all these same, all the Brown Act requirements, and when we talk about what's been waived or suspended, is going to equally apply to committees or other entities that are also subject to the Brown Act. They may not be meeting as often right now, but those same things we're talking about are going to apply there as well. And I think also, and maybe I'll get the panel's thoughts on this, but there's also a small group of committees like LCAP committees and others that are subject to essentially some of the Brown Act's requirements. And I think the consensus is that to the extent that those are inconsistent with the executive orders, that the executive orders would also suspend some of those in-person requirements.
The only comment that I might add is I thought you did a great job providing a good background discussion here, but on the role of the emergency meeting, remember that you're supposed to give notice to the news media. So the idea is you're essentially treating the news media the same as your board. So if you're giving them the hour's notice, you have to call the news media and you're inviting them to the emergency meeting. But I wouldn't want our conversation about the ability to hold an emergency meeting to I don't want to leave that with the idea we're recommending it. In other words, most of the time, I think you're going to stay with your regular board meeting schedule. And if something comes up, call a special board meeting, use the 24 hours and post the notice. It's almost hard to imagine that we're really going to find ourselves in a situation where we don't need to post a 24-hour notice and we're just going to hold a meeting and call the media. So we probably don't want to use the emergency exception to the Brown Act, even in our world of school closures.
That's a great point.
Okay, well, I think then we can move on to the next couple of slides. So what we wanted to do was to talk next about the requirements for holding a meeting and start to get into both the legal requirements and also some of the logistical challenges and things that we've seen in really the past 6 weeks or so. So if we go to the next slide, what we wanted to start with was what hasn't changed. So we know that we have the executive orders that suspended some of the Brown Act requirements, but a lot of the Brown Act requirements are still there. They're still in place, but maybe with a little bit different of a practical consequence than we had before this crisis. So to begin with, I think one thing that's clear is there's no change in the purpose or sort of the policy behind the Brown Act, right? The idea is to provide transparency for the public to be able to observe and to address public meetings, see how the public's business is done. That hasn't changed. If you look at the end of the executive orders on this, the governor says specifically that essentially if there's kind of a question, the agency should be looking towards what is going to maximize transparency and provide access to meetings. So I think, as usual, when we get into some of the gray areas in the Brown Act, which right now there's maybe a few more than there normally are, going back to what is the purpose, what is the policy behind the Brown Act, that transparency piece, which I think dovetails really nicely with what was mentioned previously about the perception of the public and the expectations. Those two things usually line up. So I think when we get into some of those areas about some of the new logistical questions, going back to what is the purpose, the policy, how can we best serve that in how we actually hold meetings and interact with the public. So that hasn't ultimately changed. Another thing that hasn't changed, and I think there was a question about this earlier, was the use of closed sessions. So as was mentioned, the default rule under the Brown Act, as I'm sure you're all aware, is that the discussions, the actions need to be taken in open session. Again, back to this idea that the transparency so the public can see their business being conducted. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but you need a explicit exception in the Brown Act in order to take something into closed session. So ones I think mentioned before that we usually see: litigation, personnel, labor, student matters, those types of things can go into closed session when they're properly agendized. There is not a sort of carte blanche COVID-19 closed session exemption. So you won't find anything in the executive orders that says if you're having a discussion about coronavirus or COVID-19 or the pandemic, you can take that into closed session regardless of any other provision of the Brown Act. So just because it's about the current situation, that doesn't allow it to go into closed session. That being said, if it still fits under either, as I mentioned, litigation, personnel, labor, a matter about a specific student, if it has a connection to COVID-19, which right now is very possible, it may be something that you can take into closed session. That's a place you want to be talking with your legal counsel to make sure it's appropriate to go into closed session. But I wanted to make sure that everyone realized that there's not just a blanket exception right now for those matters to go into closed session. And the other one, actually I wanted to quickly mention when we talk about closed session exemptions, because I think it's one that's not used very often, but it might have some application here, is I think the one that was mentioned previously about threats to security. So there's a provision that allows closed session discussions with law enforcement or security consultants when you're talking about a threat to security of public buildings or essential public services. So I think you've got to have that hook of law enforcement or a security consultant, but that may be something in this case that applies, may not be, again, something to talk to your counsel about if you've got a question. But otherwise, the majority of these discussions are going to be things that need to be happening in open session under the Brown Act. One of the other things that hasn't changed, and again mentioned earlier, was no change in the notice period. So as far as the amount of time that you're posting agendas before meetings, whether it be 72, 24, 1 hour, whatever it is, those have not changed. But I do think it's important to think about how that works with what the public's, the type of communication that's going on with the public right now. They obviously can't come in most places, actually in the state, to the public, to the district office to ask questions. So they're going to be relying more on that notice. So, does it make sense to put it out a little bit earlier if you can? The other thing that I was going to mention about that, and we'll talk, I know there's a lot of questions about public comment, and we're going to get there in a couple slides. If you're taking public comment in advance of the meeting, thinking, and if there's going to be a cutoff for when that public comment has to be submitted, think about the interplay between the time that the public comment is, that deadline, and when the agenda is posted, to make sure there's sufficient time for people to actually submit comments. I mean, you could think of a hypothetical situation where you post a special meeting 24 hours in advance and ask for public comment 24 hours in advance, and you've essentially eliminated public comment. I think that's an extreme situation, but something to be thinking about when you set those deadlines and when you're doing your posting. So maybe posting a little bit earlier if that's possible. Finally, agenda requirements. Again, this is a place where we haven't seen a reduction. We actually have seen a change here, and that's requiring some additional things that we're going to talk about in a minute. But I wanted to make sure, again, that everyone realizes that still the basic requirements to obviously have an agenda with agenda items is still in place under the Brown Act. Once again, those agenda items have to have enough of a description, a general description is what the Attorney General has said, so that members of the public know that if it's an item, they can identify what the item is and decide if that's something that if they have their comment or they want to see the discussion, they know that's the time that they need to come to the meeting, or in this case, log in perhaps or call in to see what the board is either going to discuss or decide to do. So again, that's again very important because we don't have a lot of the in-person contact that might otherwise be supplementing the agenda right now. Finally, I think Mike was mentioned a minute ago, you obviously have the agenda item requirement with the addition of either using the emergency item where that applies or an urgency item to add to the agenda. If I get the next slide, please. So I think this is one of the two big things that we're going to be talking about today. Obviously, the how the electronic meetings are held and the public comment piece. As far as electronic meetings, as you all know, previously the Brown Act did actually allow in some respects for electronic meetings, although it was primarily through telephonic appearances, and what we were usually seeing it used for was 1 or 2 board members who may be traveling or for some reason couldn't physically attend a board meeting. And the Brown Act allowed for those members to attend by telephone, although I think we had started to see more folks attend either by video call or Skype or whatever it may be. The Brown Act imposed several requirements on that didn't make it quite as practical or flexible as maybe sometimes would be helpful. Specifically, it required that the location the person was calling from be open and accessible to the public. And accessible, we mean essentially ADA compliant. The location had to be listed on the agenda. The agenda had to be posted locations, and you had to allow public comment on those locations, which, at the end of the day, probably meant you weren't going to get board members calling in from their personal residences. There were a few more requirements, but really I think that's what ultimately would limit the use of that pre-COVID-19. But if we go to the next slide, you can see what the governor's order did that really provides a lot more flexibility. If we go to that next slide, please. So what you can see, those first 4 or 5 requirements there, those are the things that have been suspended by the executive order, which essentially means at the end of the day, the location from which someone is calling in from or video conferencing in from doesn't need to be open and accessible. The address doesn't need to be listed on the board agenda. You don't have to allow public comment from that location. So again, takeaway, board members would be able to call in from their personal residence. A lot of other places that under quote unquote, I guess you could say normal Brown Act rules wouldn't be allowed. So that's where this flexibility has come. And I know a lot of districts are already obviously taking advantage of this given the shelter in place orders. So those are the things that have been suspended. What has been added? Well, 2 things that are still there that we need to be thinking about. One, for any electronic or telephonic meeting, all the votes need to be taken by roll call. Simple reason there, especially if you have a telephonic meeting, it may be hard to tell who's voting which way. So the roll call is a requirement of the Brown Act. The second one is not so much a Brown Act requirement, but I think something has been mentioned and that we recommend, which is to at least think about and have a plan for how you're going to address any technical problems that happen during the meeting. This is something either you could have just a discussion before the meeting to figure out how you're going to deal with it, or maybe even putting something on the agenda to say, if we're in the middle of a meeting and one of the 5 board members loses their internet connection, what are we going to do? Is the meeting going to continue, or are we going to stop and wait for that person to come back in? Again, not a legal requirement, but I think something you want to be thinking about before it happens, because it's going to be easier to address it then as opposed to in the moment if something were to happen. And I'm sure as we have more of these meetings that will in fact occur. So those are kind of 2 of the old requirements, quote unquote. I think the new ones, and the big one here, is the ability for the public to observe and address telephonically or otherwise electronically the board meeting, right? So the ability not only to run a board meeting electronically, sort of the waiver part, but then the new part is then to allow the public to observe and address the board telephonically. And we're going to talk about in the next slide what exactly that means. But from an agenda perspective, the first thing it means is that the agenda needs to indicate to the public how exactly it is that they can either observe or address the board. So that language needs to be on the agenda itself. And actually, I've seen quite a number of districts that I think is a really good practice of actually putting together sort of a more in-depth discussion about either how to observe or how to address, so that the public can, as a standalone document, get instructions on how to do those things. Because I think a lot of members of the public are probably familiar roughly with how to come to a board meeting and maybe provide public comment, or at least they might know where to go. This is a whole new world. They may have to use a different program. So I think having those instructions out there for the public may help in the long run, both from a transparency perspective and also a lot less questions that you might have to answer one-off. Finally, the agenda also needs to note, and there needs to be a procedure for resolving accessibility requests. This is sort of similar to the provision that maybe, again, in normal times when we dealt with accessibility to the physical location and how those would be handled. Now we're talking about accessibility to the electronic means, telephonic or otherwise, that the board may be using. So the agenda needs to include a provision, and you could probably slightly revise what's already on there to indicate who somebody should contact if they need to request accommodations or other reasonable modifications. We go to the next slide, please. Perfect. So, I think the big question that we keep getting, of course, is what's the best way to do this? And I think in a lot of respects, it really depends on the district. There's a lot of different models that might work. I think you have to think about, obviously what works for the board, what works for the community, if there's boards that are already using some sort of live streaming platform, could you continue to do that? There's a lot of different things. Accessibility for members of the public. Are there folks who are going to be able to access the internet? Does it make more sense to use a telephonic or a combination of those 2 things to promote access and transparency? A lot of different things to think about. One question that I think we were kind of pondering is the word observe in the executive order. It says that the public shall be able to observe the meeting. Does that connotate a video essentially versus telephonically? I think the answer is probably no. The answer is no, because if you look at the executive order itself, it then talks about, it says observe or attend telephonically or otherwise electronically. So I think a telephonic option is definitely one, as well as some sort of video conference or live stream or a combination of those 2. Those are all acceptable under the executive order. I did a quick kind of random survey of what different districts were using. It looked to me that probably 70 to 80, 85% of districts had some sort of video live stream platform, maybe not completely interactive, but at least like a live stream on YouTube or something to that effect. And the rest were using a telephonic call-in system or meeting for folks to observe. So again, either one of those are okay as long as you have the ability, or the public has the ability to observe and address the meeting. That brings, of course, with it a lot of logistical challenges, things that the boards hadn't dealt with until moving to this full electronic meetings, and I think people are still kind of working out. We wanted to talk about a few of the ones that we've seen more questions about and how you might come at them. One, just as far as the logistics of running an electronic meeting, if you're switching platforms or if you're still having issues, doing a dry run or a test meeting is something that is probably a good idea. Completely legal under the Brown Act, as long as you don't have any substantive discussions. But that might be a good thing to make sure everybody gets on and understands how it works and knows, where to find the mute button, that kind of a thing. So that's definitely something that you can look at. Other types of questions, I saw one pop up about the Pledge of Allegiance, which is really kind of an interesting question. Maybe one of the very first things that you do at a board meeting. But how are you going to handle that? Thinking about that, are you going to have a slide, maybe of the American flag that could come up as part of the slideshow and do it that way? There might be a couple different ways to handle that. One other thing that comes up at the beginning of a meeting to be thinking about is closed session and the switch between open and closed session and how you're going to handle that. Because one thing you want to be careful of is there's still a Brown Act requirement that the public be allowed to address matters on the closed session agenda before closed session. So you can't start a meeting, you can't go into closed session and then open up the public meeting after. You have to open it up before that closed session. So are you going to open that meeting telephonically or electronically, the open session first, allow those comments if there's any disclosure needed for the closed session items, then switch platforms or switch meetings into closed session and then come back, so that you can do it that way. And also you don't want to have an accidental open closed session, obviously. So I think switching meetings or even switching platforms might be a good thing to be thinking about when you go in and out of closed session. Another question we've had a lot of is, what about disruptions? And I think in an odd way, electronic meetings might be a little bit easier to control depending on what system you have than in-person meetings. And that if someone is causing a disruption, the ability to either mute or disconnect somebody electronically is probably going to logistically be easier than it would be to physically remove someone from a meeting. To that point, the standard is still the same that it was when we had in-person meetings, and that the disruption has to be to the point that it's actually preventing the board from conducting any business. At that point, then the Brown Act does allow you to remove that person, or in this case, maybe mute or exclude them from the meeting. But it has to rise to that level. It can't be short of that. Otherwise, you run into a variety of other concerns. So I think be a little bit careful about how you use that, but it also goes to what kind of system do you want to use? Is it going to be easier to address those types of disruptions with a video conference system where you can see who's there and who's not, versus maybe a telephonic system that might not allow that? So another thing to be thinking about. Finally, the last one thing I just wanted to mention, we also got some questions on, is can you hold public hearings at these types of meetings? And the answer to that is yes as well. The electronic meetings are public meetings of the board, just like non-electronic meetings were prior to this. So public hearings can also be held there. I think the only exception would be if there's a statute, which we've not run into yet, that requires physical attendance at a public hearing. That might be different, but I think for the most part, that is not the case. So, I think the last two things I wanted to touch on real quickly before we get to the public comment. One is on record creation. So one thing that's going to happen with having electronic meetings, whether it be public comments by email or recordings of the actual meetings themselves, is we're going to be creating more records of the district than would have otherwise existed from a meeting, and those all may be subject to disclosure under the Public Records Act. So be thinking about that. On the meeting itself, as far as recording it, there's not a requirement that you do or you don't. It would probably be easier for as far as minutes to record it. If you do record it, this is the same as the rule that was previous to this. The district has to hold on to it for at least 30 days unless your board policies require it to be held on to longer than that. So again, you're creating a new record. And to that point, I think if you are going to record it, it would be worth a disclaimer or some sort of statement either on the agenda at the beginning of the meeting reminding folks that as part of this meeting, it's going to be recorded, that either their audio or their visual representations may be captured as part of that recording, just so that everyone is on the same page about that as well. And then I think the last thing, just starting to think about, and maybe optimistically, is what does the future look like, or what does the next stage look like? If you look at the executive orders, these suspensions are in effect until so long as the shelter-in-place orders are there. As those begin to be lifted, some of these exceptions are going to fall away, but are we still going to be looking at potentially some sort of middle ground where we have hybrid, electronic, and in-person meetings? What is that going to look like? How are the systems that you're going to maybe start using now going to adapt to that process? I think it's something to start thinking about, along with the idea of, is the public going to have different expectations about access to board meetings following this crisis when we go back to in-person meetings, and what's that going to look like, and what are the expectations we're setting now? So I'm not sure there's good answers to those questions, but I think things to be thinking about as you determine what kind of system you want to use and how you're going to run your meetings. If we go to the next slide, maybe bring the panel back and see if there's any comments or questions.
Well, you did a great job summarizing there. A few thoughts that occurred to me as you were talking is that at the end of the governor's order, he urges school districts to use, in his words, sound discretion and reasonable efforts to comply. So I think your point that there are alternative methods or combinations is a point worth emphasizing, that what may work for one district may not work for another, and that we have the ability to use sound discretion and reasonable efforts to implement. The other thought that was occurring to me, I wanted to kind of emphasize the point that you made really well, and that is closed session confidentiality. Your point about, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, about the public's right to comment prior to closed session. I really do think that you've got to have two different call-in numbers if you're doing it telephonically, or switching platforms, but just making sure that the board is clear about how are we sort of doing roll call, pledge, convening to closed session, and then switching platforms, going to closed session. And at that point, probably trying to articulate to the public that we're projecting we're going to be back in open session at around 7 a.m. and so forth. So in some ways, communications improve, but it's also more difficult. And one of the things that I think we're going to have to be very careful about is inviting public participation in a way where we're communicating on our agenda. How does this work? Because the public would have the right to look at that open session part, to comment on the closed session item before you convene into closed session. So detailing that out on your agenda about, here's where we're going to email comments. We're going to do it via this Zoom platform. Here's your link. I think our agenda notice requirements have become more detailed, and that we need to not necessarily assume that everybody knows how to use all these platforms. So to do it in plain English and make it as simple as possible, so that we're meeting the underlying purpose of public transparency here.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely, like I mentioned, I think I've liked the districts that have had essentially a standalone document, like you said, in plain English, that explains this is how we're going to run the meetings, this is how you can watch, this is how you comment, and even posting that separately, maybe on the page where the board agendas otherwise are, so that it's people can find it a little bit easier. I think that's, right now it's different for everybody. So the more information we can provide or instructions, I think, the better we are. But I was going to ask, were there any other three of you have had other experiences, either with districts you've heard of using these technologies and things that have worked or haven't worked?
Well, I think one of the
Go ahead, Bob.
Sorry about that, Mike. One thing I think that is important to know, like you guys were talking about, the making sure that there's documentation on how to use the technical aspects of it. I know there are several platforms out there for agenda management, for video conferencing like Zoom and whatnot. Some of them do have breakout rooms that you can use for closed session. I think there's a potential risk in that if you don't really know how to use the software, that you could be exposing closed session items publicly. So I like Mike's suggestion of having a separate meeting, whether it's on a different platform or the same platform, to make sure you have that good divide. But I have heard of one instance where somebody did think they were going into closed session, and it turns out they weren't. So that's an important note. But sorry, Mike, you go ahead now.
Well, a couple thoughts. One, for example, we were doing some negotiations, and part of the negotiations was the confidential, right, the team's conversation, and then the other was with the association itself. And so we created 2 different Zoom call-in numbers, had both platforms going simultaneously. So we used the Zoom platform with this particular ID for our confidential part, and then the separate identification number for the open session part. And that applies equally to the board meeting idea. So that would be one way of doing that. And William, I was intrigued by your comment about the new norms, because I do think that we're likely to see higher expectations. The idea of enhancing our in-person board meetings once the social distancing measures have been lifted with electronics is probably going to occur, just my projection. So for example, we were at a school district meeting about a week ago or so, and it was a public hearing. And what we heard from the community was that they truly appreciated the ability to provide email comments and to participate in the board meeting. It was a Zoom platform, and there was live comments being made. And folks said, you know, I have children at home, and I can't normally come to a board meeting. So the folks that might just, it's a busy time, they have children, they lack transportation, the access to public participation was greatly enhanced by the ability to use technology. So it's a little bit contrary to our instinct, because I know CSBA and all of us are worried about, can we provide hotspots? Can we provide devices? How do we ensure equity for distance learning and for participation at a board meeting? And then the flip side of that is that the electronics is enhancing the public's ability to participate.
Yeah, no, all their points. I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see, you know, how that develops, and I'm sure the legislature will help us with that. But nonetheless, a lot of interesting experiences. And, you know, and obviously board members, I'm sure, are talking to other boards and seeing what's working in different places. What are your neighbors doing, that type of thing, and learning from everyone's experiences as we're just, you know, about 6 or 7 weeks into this right now. I think is it to turn it over to public comment, which is what everybody wants to know about.
Okay, so our next topic is public participation. So as we all know, the idea of the public's right to comment and participate in a board meeting is a critical feature of the Brown Act's goal of transparency and public accountability. Next slide, please. So we all know the axiom that the board's meeting is a meeting that's being held in public, not the public's meeting. And I think that's really important to remember, especially during this time of virtual board meetings, that when we hold a board meeting, it's not intended as a town hall dialogue and interaction with the public where we're debating the merits of the district's business with members of the public. This is a meeting in which the board is there to accomplish discussion and action on various agenda items. We're simply doing it in a public arena so that the public is aware of how board members are voting and aware of the issues and are allowed to comment. So that the key concept here is that we're allowing comment prior to board action so that the public has the right to participate and members of the public can give input. But remember that the time constraints that were in existence prior to the pandemic remain in existence. So for example, if we want to limit members of the public's ability to speak to 2 or 3 minutes per person or 20 minutes per topic, those same time limits will be in place in a virtual board meeting. For example, I know we had a client, a Bay Area client this week, where they had a very controversial item on their agenda. They were holding their board meeting virtually, and there were literally hundreds of comments. The board was concerned and so interested in public participation that the meeting went on past midnight and they had to hold a second meeting. So one of the things to remember is, while that was perfectly lawful and was within the board's discretion and certainly met the purpose of the Brown Act, it wasn't legally required. You can still enforce the 2-minute or 3-minute limit, and you can still enforce the per topic limit. So it's probably just as important, or perhaps more important now, to remember to have your board president at the time you get to especially the general public comment period, to remind members of the public that the board is there to listen and that we care about their comments, but we're not going to be interacting and having dialogue with them about their comments. Next slide, please. So the Brown Act provides 3 opportunities for public participation at each board meeting. We just had a conversation about the first time. The members of the public will have the right to comment on closed session items before the board actually adjourns to closed session. And that's the reason you have to open your meeting in public. You then have to disclose, we're going to go into closed session to discuss this litigation matter and this particular personnel matter, negotiations with the Teachers Association, whatever your agenda items might be. You then ask for public comment on any of those closed session items, and then at the conclusion of that, you would adjourn to closed session. So the first time that public has the right to comment is prior to closed session. Secondly, members of the public have the right to comment on any agenda item before or during the board's discussion of that agenda item. And again, the idea here is public input before board action. So that's the second time. The third time is the members of the public have the right to comment on items not on the agenda. And this is the visitor comment or the general public comment, which is required feature of every regular board meeting. And it's this period when you have these general comments not on an agenda item that we often need to remind both our boards as well as members of the public that the idea here is that the board members are listening. So providing comments, but not necessarily engaging in dialogue and losing control of your meeting. So the last thing we wanted to mention was the difference between a regular board meeting and a special board meeting with respect to public comment. So at a regular board meeting, the Brown Act requires that you have public comment on items not on the agenda. However, at a special board meeting, if you want to have a board workshop or a focused board retreat on the budget update or your LCAP or whatever your topic might be, you only have to allow public comment on the agenda items. So if you want to make your special board meeting a little more focused, you can delete that opportunity for the public to comment on items not on your agenda. And oftentimes in board meetings that can take 15 minutes to 30 minutes. And so for efficiency's sake, I do see a lot of school districts with special board meetings only eliminating that feature. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about the pandemic, school closures, and how do we accomplish public comment. So of course, the key concept in the governor's order, which he updated on March the 17th, was that we don't have to have a physical location for our meeting anymore. So how do we do public comment with a virtual board meeting? And as William indicated, I think the key phrase in the governor's order is the third bullet there, where the public should be able to comment telephonically or otherwise electronically. So that's the kind of magic words that comes out of the governor's order. And that's the reason I think from an agenda perspective that we have to do that plain English direction. So for example, we're going to be taking public comment via voicemail message or via email. Our meeting will start at this time. We will use this platform, and here's how to connect with us. So I think our agenda notices have actually got to be more detailed and have more information in them than prior to the pandemic. Next slide, please. I think we're now to the heart of the conversation about how do we do public comment? What are the options available? And is there a best practice? So let me start with the concept that I think that districts vary. We vary in size, vary in the amount of public participation, in board member interest in transparency, and community interest in transparency. So there's really no one right way to do this. Again, the governor has given us sound discretion to choose among multiple options. And as you go through the options that might be right for your board and your community, I think we're in a place where we're having to balance technicalities and making sure we're meeting the legal requirements with what may be your community's interest in increased transparency and accountability. So it's using your board's discretion to find the sweet spot that works right for you and your community. So that being said, let's talk about some of the ways in which we're seeing this happen. So the first bullet talks about getting public comment by emails in advance. I'm seeing this being done by a lot of school districts, and I think it's been quite effective. One of the first things that occurred to me as we began trying to draft agendas and saying to members of the public that if you want to comment, send us an email, is we realized that we needed to make sure that we required the email to identify the topic. In other words, I'm sending an email on item 4, and I'm going to give you a separate email that addresses item 8, or just in some way I'm going to clarify those. The next item that we came about with is an email sometimes people like to write, and we really don't want to be reading the novel at the time of the board meeting. So if you Google how many words per minute people normally speak, it turns out that people speak about 150 words per minute. So the limitation in terms of number of words should probably be built into this email option. So for example, if you normally, under your board bylaw, which is probably bylaw 9323 on the conduct of board meetings, if you have a 3-minute per person rule, then your email should indicate, and your agenda should make note, that we're not going to be receiving an email that's longer than 450 words, or approximately 3 minutes. So think about the technical parts of that so that we can implement the public participation via email in a way that works. Now, once you've got the emails, what are your options? And it strikes me that you've got one or two options here. And again, we're probably back to the balancing between what might be lawful and what might be in the spirit of transparency. So what I'm seeing most boards do is if you received 2 emails on a particular agenda item, a designated member of the staff is reading those emails out loud at the time that agenda item is called. And you would read them until you hit the 3-minute rule or the 450 words. A second way to do it would be to distribute those emails in advance to the entire board. You would then make sure, I think you probably need to do this in a roll call way. So for example, the board president could say, Board Member A, have you read all of the public comments on this agenda item? And then we would want an acknowledgement from each board member that they have read and received public comment on that agenda item. So while that's technically compliant with the law, it doesn't allow members of the public to hear what other members of the public are saying. Now, the Brown Act is not clear really about whether members of the public have the right to hear about what others are saying, but you can see the call here would be a question of being legally sound, or in the interest of transparency, am I going to read for 3 minutes per comment up to my, for example, 20-minute limit per item. So I'm seeing the emails being used a lot. Most districts are reading them, and most districts are enforcing both the per comment and per topic time limit. And I think that's a really viable way to go. A second alternative might be to indicate in your board notice that you will be receiving voicemail messages. Call this number, you leave a message, and then that voicemail message would be read or transcribed and given to the board in advance of the meeting. So if you're going to read the voicemail message that came in, it would have been transcribed, and now we have a staff person that's reading it, or you're simply playing the voicemail message at the time of the meeting. Think about the logistics. So what if someone calls and leaves a voicemail message and it goes on for 10 minutes? Again, you're going to have to listen to those ahead of time, think about it, and you're probably going to wind up transcribing the voicemail message and then imposing the 3-minute per message limit. So there are some logistics to think about if you decide to use either email or the voicemail option. The third option that I think I've seen districts use, and that is the idea to member to the public would say, I would like to comment on agenda item number 1. So we're going to be doing this live during the board meeting. They send the email, and then you would respond to say, okay, you are caller number 2 on that agenda item. We expect to be getting there at 7:15 a.m. or p.m. So we'll be calling you back about 7:15, and then you make your comment. So it's controlled. It's like a speaker card where a member of the public is letting us know in advance that they want to comment on that particular agenda item, and then we're calling them back and inviting them into the meeting, and then we're controlling the time and the number of the speakers because we're getting it lined up in advance, and we know we have no speakers on agenda item 1 and 3 speakers on agenda item 2. We can put them in a queue and we can impose our reasonable time restrictions. So that's an idea where you're organizing public comment in advance with a call-in number, but it's happening live at the board meeting. The fourth option, which we've seen some boards use, is the actual video streaming platform. So for example, if you are conducting the open session part of your board meeting on a Zoom platform and the board members and the staff are all participating, you could then you can raise your hand in the Zoom feature, and then we would unmute that person and allow them to speak. The problem, and a lot of people have been reading about this, is the Zoom bombing experience. We had a client just this week that was using Zoom and allowing live comments being made during the agenda item, and the meeting got disrupted because the person who was being videotaped and was being allowed to speak began actually undressing, and it became a profane situation, got out of hand. Luckily, it got cut off before any of this happened, but it took the board an hour to get it back into place. And so the Zoom bombing became a difficulty because it was all going live and it wasn't being controlled in advance. So it is perfectly permissible. Most of the time, we probably won't have any issues, but certainly something to think about. So again, the idea here is to use sound discretion using one or more of these options or any alternative. So again, you might be starting your meeting on a Zoom platform, allowing members of the public to see everybody who's there, commenting on closed session items. Then you're going into a second closed session alternative platform to ensure the confidentiality of your meeting. And then you're coming back and, for example, reading the emails or reading the transcribed voicemail messages as a way of getting public participation. Now, one of the thoughts that I had about when you're reading those public comments is you may have the district board secretary or other designated person, the public information officer, for example, reading those comments. It's probably helpful to have that person identify themselves to say, for example, I am the public information officer. I am now going to be reading public comments about this particular agenda item. The board neither endorses nor condones nor criticizes these comments. So some kind of a disclaimer so that we make sure that everyone is recognizing that this is not district speech, it's speech from a member of the community, and we have that scripted. The next question that has arisen is we've seen some questions about, well, do I post public comments? So example, what if you have a controversial matter on your agenda and you receive lots of public comments and you want to enforce your 20-minute limit, but you receive so many comments that couldn't all be read? Should you post them on your website? So I think the answer to that is your call. Is it lawful to post them on the website? Yes. But when you do that, remember that they may live forever. And we wouldn't normally do that, right? Normally people would come to a board meeting, they would speak for their 2 or 3 minutes, and they would sit down, and no record would be kept unless there's a recording of the meeting that's being retained for longer than the 30-day period. But be careful about the fact that if we're sending email messages to a majority of the board, we may be creating a public record, and if we do post them on your website, we may be giving a platform for community members to speak that they may be inappropriate comments or lots of comments or starting a dialogue that you may not want to see occur. So I'd be very thoughtful about whether or not you want to be posting public comments. So I think I'll skip the next agenda item because we've talked about the need to be clear in your agenda. And let's talk for a moment about First Amendment considerations. So free speech hasn't gone away, even with the social distancing requirements and now virtual board meetings. So we know that members of the public have the right to come and criticize individual people or board practices. And the Brown Act has a statute right on point that says public criticism has to be allowed. But in our electronic world, it's going to be easier now than ever to censor somebody. All I have to do is hit the mute button. Or, for example, I look at the email comments and I decide I will read these comments. They look supportive of the board, but I won't read those comments. They are not supportive of the board. So for example, when you're deciding how to read and which email comments to read, if you have an excess number, make sure you do that in a neutral, non-discriminatory way that is not based on the content of the person's speech. You may do them first in order until you run out of time, or alpha by first name or last name, and make sure that you're reading comments, even if they are critical of district operations or district employees. We may all remember the case of Baca versus Moreno Valley. That's the most cited and relied upon case here, in which the court said, look, folks have the right to come and speak their mind at board meetings, and we can't censor them. So beware of that and have a protocol in place. What if you wind up with an email message that you're about to read at the board meeting and it's filled full of profanity? Now what do we do? So the reason I'm thinking it may be practical to, for example, give your agenda notices maybe more than 72 hours ahead of time for a regular meeting. Cut off public comment via email, perhaps the evening before your board meeting. Give yourself the day of the board meeting to organize your public comments in a way that they can be then read at the meeting. You're reading them in advance, and then if someone says that blankety blank person, you're able to read the comment, but simply say something like expletive deleted. And that way we're not winding up with X-rated board meetings, and we're accomplishing the district's business in a very efficient way. But beware of it's going to be very easy to censor content that we don't like, and that's clearly unlawful in violation of the free speech clause of the First Amendment, in violation of the Baca case, and in violation of the express statutory language that's contained in the Brown Act. So there's a lot here, and I know I covered a lot. Why don't I stop here? Let's move to the group discussion, and we will invite comment here.
Hi, this is Troy, the moderator, jumping back in. Just in the interest of time, and because we received so many questions, I think we can short circuit the discussion here, and let's just move on to the Q&A if you're all right with that. Great. So you can take note of these resources here. If you don't have time to write these down, which I expect you don't, please know that we will be sending out this slideshow on either Monday or at the latest Tuesday of next week. And we will also be posting it on the COVID-19 website that CSBA operates. So you will have the chance to go over all this at your leisure. Next slide, please. Again, the question panel is on the right-hand side of your screen, but given the time, I don't think we will be able to accept any more questions. We won't get to all the ones that have been submitted so far, but this was a comprehensive presentation, and I think many of the questions you asked have been covered in the course of the panel to this point. If not, don't hesitate to email us. Next slide, please. Great. Again, we have upcoming webinars in the COVID-19 series. I won't go into those now. They're all posted on the CSBA website. I encourage you to go there and to join us for those future webinars. Now to get to some of these questions. Some of them may be a bit repetitive, but I think it's helpful on these key points to ask the questions in isolation so people can really focus on the answer. And one of the ones that we saw repeatedly asked that during online meetings, is it sufficient to receive only written public comments that will be stored and shared after the meeting, or is that not up to the legal standard?
I'll start if you want. It is sufficient to receive only emails in advance as a form of public comment. In other words, you do not have to have both email and live public comment. May you do both? Absolutely. So again, it's a question of local control. You could allow live comment during the meeting, or you could limit it to emails in advance. But you have to make sure that the board has heard the content of the public input prior to or during the conversation, not after the meeting, right? So the emails have to get to the board on any particular item before they act on it.
Great, that's very clear.
If I can just add on that real quickly, I think, going back to what we said previously about it not being it's not a public discussion. So the purpose of public comments, even when we had physical meetings, wasn't to have a back and forth between the board and members of the public. The requirement of the Brown Act is that the board have the opportunity to hear the public comment before or during that discussion, like Mike just said. So I think the idea that you need live comments because there needs to be some sort of back and forth isn't really meeting the purpose of what the Brown Act is. It's there so that the board can hear those comments or read them, as the case may be, before they either discuss or take action.
Excellent, thank you. Another person asked about requests to address the board. They want to know how this is facilitated via the teleconference and what is the proper language to use on agenda regarding requests to address the board.
Go ahead, William. You want to start there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's probably going to depend on how you do it. And this is why thinking about the different systems, if you have something like Zoom or another type of video conference where there's either a raised hand feature, whatever it may be, that would be the way to do it. You'd want to indicate that in your agenda materials that, log into the meeting. If you have a question, raise your hand, you'll be unmuted when it's time for that. I think that the teleconference, it's going to be kind of hard to do a live teleconference if you don't have control over who's muted and who's not, and trying to use that for public comment, because otherwise you're going to be depending on folks essentially to mute themselves until it's time. That may be possible for some districts. I'm not saying it isn't. I think we want to tell folks at the beginning and on the agenda is that as we get to each item, the board president or the clerk, whoever it may be, is going to pause and say, now we'll take public comment. And at that point, that would be the time to do it. It's still probably going to be a little bit of a logistical challenge if you have a lot of comments. And if you have a lot, it's probably not the system for you. I think if you have fewer comments, maybe teleconference might work, but that is going to be a challenge. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts.
I agree. I would worry about doing the conference call because, to my understanding, you lose control of your meeting. In other words, people could be talking over one another during the conference call, and you would have members of the public who could basically take control of your meeting. So while it's lawful and while it could work and while we would hope that it would work, it's not a platform that I would recommend. If I had to say, what's the best model, I guess I would wind up saying I would do the email. I would try to do my notice ahead of time. I would send the email. I would read the email. I would stay with the time restrictions. I would probably do the closed session on a Zoom platform, for example, or Google Chat, whatever the other similar platform is. Same thing for the open session, and not have the live comment during the board meeting. Just as I'm seeing a number of districts go to that. And by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this, but you can go to YouTube, for example, and click on the button. You have to get a YouTube account you have to have in advance, at least 24 hours in advance. If you create a YouTube account, you can go to the chat feature, click on the chat live feature so that you're now in open session. Let's assume you're using Zoom, and then you video conference on a live basis so everyone can observe the board meeting, but they can't speak. And that way, only members of the cabinet and the staff are able to communicate, so there's no disruption of their meeting, but then all members of the public are able to watch what the board is doing. And remember William's quote that the governor's order talks about to both observe and address. So that using that YouTube feature allows the board members to observe, and they have the right to address the board via email in advance. So if you use the combination of email and Zoom and YouTube, I think you can put those platforms together essentially at no cost or very little cost in a way that accomplishes everything without losing control of your meeting.
You can have
I would
these.
just add to emphasize on that is the notion, Mike Smith, that you raised about making sure you have some sort of cutoff deadline for the emails. I think the email system is a great idea, but making sure on your agenda you clearly state on there, you must submit these by a certain time in order for us to practically be able to get them before the meeting for public comment. Just like when you're submitting an item to be placed on the agenda and making that request, there's usually some sort of time frame spelled out for that. And I think it's important to include that and be mindful of that.
Thanks, Bob. We had another question from a civil rights perspective, wondering whether conducting meetings online might disenfranchise those who don't have access to the internet or cell phones. So curious about whether the executive order takes care of that concern or what the legal interpretation of that point is.
Well, it's a concern I certainly share, and I think a lot of people worry about that. It's a major problem, right? If I don't own a hotspot, I don't own a device, how can I participate? I think it is a civil rights issue, and it's one that we need to be sensitive to. And I know that the school districts that I'm involved with, and from both the state and a federal perspective, and I know CSBA has been very involved in trying to get devices so that folks that can't afford it can still participate. So the same thing we're talking about now applies in the special education context. It applies in the distance learning context, from just learning as well as participating in a board meeting. We've got serious civil rights issues here. And they're dramatic.
Yeah, I think access to meetings, prior to this pandemic, also raises issues of transportation, of childcare, of sort of civil rights access issues. And we see them again in different ways with access through internet and telephonically. Being able to do it either by phone or an internet when boards allow that, I do think at least creates a little bit broader group that's allowed to attend.
Good. Thank you. Another question from someone who says they've heard that certain districts have added an item to closed session called consultation, review, and recommendations for district's coronavirus response. Is this allowable and appropriate? I think the question being, is it appropriate to conduct this in closed session as opposed to out in the open during the public part of the hearing?
So just to kind of, I think we talked about this a little bit, but the short answer to that is there is not a COVID-19 coronavirus specific exemption that allows the discussion to go into closed session. There may very well be items that are related to coronavirus that otherwise meet litigation, personnel, labor, whatever it may be, that allows that to go into closed session. But the fact that it is related to the virus itself is not enough to get it into closed session, if that answers the question.
Yes, it does. Another district is using Google Forms to submit written statements, which are then read into the record during the online meeting. And this person asks that since the person who's reading the message into the record on behalf of the district may have a different reading speed than the speaker, is it appropriate to have a word limit rather than a time limit to reflect how much content is actually in the comment? Was that clear? I'm not.
Yeah, I think it is a good idea. And I guess I would always be advising the board, if it's close, read the whole thing and err on the side of public transparency and be reasonable. I think that's what the governor's trying to say is, let's make reasonable efforts. So if you have a 450 word limit for 3 minutes and it's taking the speaker 5 minutes to read that, 450 words, I would take the 5 minutes to do that. But I would put that word limit in the agenda notice. So if I had the email comment and it was 1,000 words, irrespective of how long it took the speaker, once I got past the 450, I would probably stop it right there.
Great. And I know we went over this, but I think it's an important point, so I just want to highlight it again. One questioner wanted to know whether special meetings require a notice to the media.
Go ahead, William.
Yeah, so the answer to that is not necessarily unless they've actually requested it. And I think Mike's point was if you're doing an emergency meeting, those are the folks, again, the media that's requested, those are the ones that you have to reach out to provide that 1 hour notice.
Okay. Another point that I think you touched on, but bears repeating, what if there is technical difficulty during the meeting and the meeting is delayed? Should the meeting be stopped at that point until technical issues are completely resolved?
I can take this one. I think
If the public can't fully participate, should you move forward with the meeting or should you stop until the issues are resolved?
I think it depends on a little bit of the case-by-case basis, right? Are we talking about a 5-minute delay, a 10-minute delay, or is your internet going to be down for an hour and a half? So you have to kind of take it a little bit in stride with the circumstances. And remember, as William pointed out, the idea here is that we're trying to respect the intent of the Brown Act and make sure that we are being reasonable in this world of the pandemic and trying to go forward with the public meetings as best we can. So it's really going to be a circumstantial situation, in my opinion.
The only comment I might add to that is if you did have a substantial disruption, like it took an hour to get the meeting back online, and you continued with the meeting and members of the public did not have access, that doesn't look good, first of all. And secondly, I think that you could have community members, for example, filing Public Record Act requests to say what communications occurred there. Was there any texting? Was there any email? I want to see it all, because there's oftentimes, when we're not transparent, people make bad assumptions. So I totally agree with Bob's point about play it on a case-by-case basis, but I would be hesitant to continue a meeting with a very substantial tech interruption.
And to that point, you might want to do some documentation about that, maybe post along with your minutes or somewhere on your website that we had this interruption and this is how we've addressed it. We'll be postponing or whatnot.
Makes sense. Another question related to posting is from someone who's part of the SELPA, and she mentions that when they have a superintendent's council hearing, they post the hearing notice in each district office and each school. But now, of course, the schools are closed and they either can or don't have the means to ask each school to post on their individual website, the schools that make up the SELPA. So are they at risk of violating some notice requirement, or how can they handle that?
Want me to take a shot at that one? I think it actually was a good question. I saw there was another one too about physical posting of agendas, which is a Brown Act requirement and not something that's specifically waived by the executive order, although I think there's a good question right now, what is really the purpose of doing so if theoretically nobody is going to be visiting those sites. I think this is going to be one of those situations where kind of on balance and to the extent of what the end of the executive order is, I think making reasonable efforts to comply where you can. So for a district, I think posting it at the district office, if there's somebody still going into the office, is probably a reasonable thing to do. I don't know that asking someone to go out to every school site if they're not doing it otherwise is really reasonable in this situation, given the health concerns and everything else. But I don't know, Mike, what do you think on that one?
I agree. I'm not sure about the agenda posting requirements in particular for SELPA meetings. So I don't know if there's something specific in the special ed law there, but it doesn't make sense in our environment to be posting at school sites, and both from a health perspective and certainly when we know no one's going to see it.
Speaking of a health perspective, we had a number of questions about the legality and I suppose you could call it the wisdom of having in-person meetings where social distancing measures are applied. Can you speak on that?
Well, I still have at least one client that's doing that. So there's nothing, the governor's order said that you don't have to have the in-person meeting. But if you had, for example, a 5-person board and you were only going to have the superintendent there, you could potentially do that by seating your board members far enough apart, as well as the superintendent or any staff that were in attendance. So as long as you're following the local shelter-in-place order and social distancing guidelines, then you'd still have to be making room for public participation. So are you going to have a member of the public if they come? Are they standing outside and then are they then invited in? They make their comment from a podium that is away from members of the board. So you just have to think through all the logistics. I think technically it's possible and it could work.
I'll just add in there, health being the primary concern of everybody at this point, that the business of the school district is critically important. Obviously, CSBA believes in that, but we also believe strongly in the idea of public health and maintaining that for our communities and just being mindful of that as leaders in your community. If you have an alternative means to do it, avoid exposing yourself and exposing your staff and other members of the community to this potentially deadly virus. That would be my personal view on it.
Okay. Someone asked whether the board president can ask a specific member of the public, the viewing public, I guess in this case, whether they have a comment, even if that member has not submitted a question or indicated they had a comment. Essentially, can the board president act as a teacher calling on a member of the class? Is that permissible?
I guess it's a question about what's permissible versus what may be wise. So, of course, if that happened at a meeting and I've seen that kind of thing happen and members of the public could respond, it would not be a good practice. Again, the idea is 180 degrees the other way. The idea is members of the public are going to be commenting to the board prior to board action, not board members asking members of the community for input. So it would not be consistent with best practice, but nothing, technically unlawful about it.
Good. So we've come to the end of our time. It is 2:30. It's gone really quickly, and I apologize that we weren't able to get to every question. So before we sign off, again, I want to make sure that everyone knows there's csba.org/coronavirus. There are tons of resources there and guidance related to COVID-19, and also a portal where you can submit your questions. CSBA staff is also logging all the questions that have been submitted, taking note of the ones that haven't been addressed, and we will get back to you directly. And you can always email us at any time with questions on any topic to support you in the future. So you see there our website, and if you go to the final slide, there's contact information if you have questions about this event or other issues related to CSBA. Next slide, please. Yeah. Thank you. So again, thanks for joining us. I know it's a very hectic time and everyone is busy. I want to thank our panelists for so much great information. This has been our most successful panel ever in terms of viewer interest by a significant amount, and so many good questions were submitted to us. So we want to continue to help you and support you in whatever way we can. Best of luck in your work serving students and community, and goodbye for now.